Symposium on Franchise Law. My name is Robert Emerson. I teach business law at the University of Florida, and I write principally in franchising. And in fact, if you're pleased with this proceeding, I will take credit for it. If you're not so pleased, of course, it is the responsibility of Stanford Law School and people associated with it. But I've been pushing for a symposium at a law school for the past few years, premised on the notion that franchising is one of those areas that is very important, obviously, that's why I do research in it, but an area that often is overlooked in our law schools, and not just at our greatest law schools, such as Stanford, but most law schools. It typically falls in some area where if people do research on it, maybe they do one article and then they're out and they go back to their home territory, whether it's antitrust law or contracts or whatever that may be. And in terms of teaching, if an area isn't researched regularly by a particular faculty member, as you know, often that means that there is no course that is devoted to that topic. I think that may be changing. I note that there was a casebook that came out just last summer or fall that is sort of pushing law professors to consider teaching sort of a standalone course on franchise law. And most of the authors in there, some are practicing lawyers, but I think a lot of them are actually law professors. I enjoy doing research in franchising partly because there aren't that many competitors, I suppose, in the academic world. My fellow authors often come from practice, not from the professorial community. But I also love it partly for the same reason that many of us went to law school. And that is we went to law school because we couldn't figure out what else to do. And I kind of went to franchising because I thought correctly, it turns out, that you can do research in a number of areas and it all relates to franchising. Franchising, as we all know, is not really an industry. It's not really a business so much as it is a method for distribution of goods or services, a method for setting up, say, a network of producers or service providers. And so you have all the issues associated with such a span of services. You have contracts, of course, but you also have torts, you have agency, you have issues regarding antitrust. In fact, that's probably where most of the impetus originally in franchise law came out of the antitrust concerns. And so I've been fortunate enough to wear or put on many hats. I teach very, very large classes. And so I tend to, and these are undergrad and MBA classes typically. Occasionally I go to law schools, but most of my teaching I'm housed in the business school at the University of Florida. And with large classes, televised, put on the internet, I've learned you have to be sort of a showman. So I bring hats. I sometimes get students enchanted with franchising by talking about franchises, which can be defined in so many different ways. Since at Florida, we are basically a division powerhouse, NCAA powerhouse in athletics, and occasionally an academic powerhouse to accompany that. I get the students enchanted by bringing various franchised hats. My alma mater, Harvard Law School, not known necessarily for athletics, unlike Stanford. The Tampa Bay Rays, who finally got good, they're my closest baseball team, finally got good, but the fans in St. Pete decided they still weren't going to go to the games. The most odious franchise known to mankind, the New York Yankees. And don't think I'm a Red Sox fan. I used to sympathize with them, but they've gotten just as nasty as the Yankees the last few years. And then, of course, my favorite team of all, as a Marylander, go O's. So my intent, I don't know if the camera is picking this up, because I teach with many hats and props and costumes, my intent is when I give my talk, and maybe if we have to do it during the panel, is I'm going to see if I can use every single hat that I brought with me to the presentation. I don't even know how many hats it is. I look at all these and I think of the checkout line at a grocery store. I'm one of those types who, if I went to the one that says 10 or less, I would view all of these as one item. Well, it's just hats. So we'll see how many I might do. Franchising, the history of franchising goes back to an old French word devoted to freedom or rights. And this is why when you do research, of course, you can find franchise in all sorts of areas, such as the right of voting and the like. And it goes back to a time when often businesses were restricted, highly regimental, highly hierarchical. If you could have a franchise, that was something. You can cut through that quickly just to show you you're not really getting the full Monty here, thank God. It could be far worse, but I had to fly here and there's only so much you can stuff in a suitcase. There are lots of stories in franchising. There are lots of stories in law. I mean, that's partly what we are, isn't it? Especially in a common law environment where we tell the case, and the case is a story which, if you're a practicing lawyer, you're hoping is moving the jury or the judge. Is that man our friend or is he not? That's a question I pose when I talk to my classes about antitrust law or class actions or not. You know, Zorro, is he good? Is he bad? Why is he putting all those Z's on people's chests? We don't know. We know that Antonio Banderas is exceptionally good looking, but that still doesn't tell us whether it's good or bad. And franchising is great because it poses all these issues, eternal issues of to regulate or not. Franchisor or franchisee? What about the interests of society as a whole? And so there are all these fundamental problems that can arise. At their core, I think you can find maybe a handful of issues which make up most of the litigation. Issues such as competition, issues obviously such as termination. That's where the costs are extreme enough that people are a little bit more likely to actually fight. And all the issues associated with running any sort of a business network can play out in the franchising area. I thought I'd just give one example here in the introduction, and that is the internet, since we're in the middle of Silicon Valley here, very, very impressive, Palo Alto. Google, as you know, has run into all sorts of issues in terms of its worldwide range and problems that have developed in various parts of the world. The approach that's taken, for instance, in China can and likely will be a lot different than, say, taken by the EU or by the United States, assuming there is even an approach. And so in the world of e-commerce, it behooves us in the franchise field, and this is where you're seeing more and more research, I think, developing, to talk about what does this mean in the area of the internet, or as some senators would say, the internets or the big tubes. Part of the problem is franchising is often very geographically based. The franchises that we tend to think of that first come to mind, if you ask somebody, wake them up in the middle of the night and say, franchising, the first thing that they're going to say is, what are you doing in my room? And then the next thing they're going to say is, you know, McDonald's. They're going to say fast food. They may think of hotels. They're usually going to think of things that I think that tend to be sort of geographically discrete enterprises, often small businesses, often community housed, the type of things that could be run just as well sometimes by mom and pop groups, not franchised. And then the internet, as we know, is, you know, it's worldwide. So you get a lot of issues associated with that distinction. And that's why at least some people have said you really need a single unified brand, if you will, for the websites or website dedicated to any particular franchised network. But that isn't how it's always worked out in franchising. And it's been broken down by some people into four sort of areas. You have no restrictions. You have, I don't think anybody really adopts the Luddite approach. If they ever did, that clearly had to disappear. All of us now have cell phones. All of us now use the internet. Email is passé. I mean, who would not have some sort of internet access? Internet use for advertising, that's perhaps where it first grew. And then a lot of people believe that we've moved more and more towards each franchisee having its own web page, but more and more directions from franchisors in terms of how they can run and the links and all of that. And this is where a lot of at least understanding between the people in a franchise network needs to take place to avoid any sort of misunderstanding and potential lawsuits. But all of the issues associated with the internet can play out in franchising. You could have a cyber squatting issue. You could have, I haven't written about this, but I've read things about it online sometimes, the issue of the social media. And this is certainly a hot topic of the initial regulation of franchising in the states, and then even at the Federal Trade Commission, arose in a pre-internet environment, or at least at that point it was just an idea bubbling in Al Gore's head and a few other people back in the 60s and 70s. But as we have moved into a social media environment, I don't know about you, I'm not a huge fan of Facebook. I don't really use it. I feel like I'm a little too old to be using it, and maybe I'll be seen as lurking about where my kids are actually supposed to be lurking. But you can't avoid Facebook, can you? You can't avoid LinkedIn. I joined LinkedIn at one point. And so naturally in the franchising community, there are issues more and more bubbling about the usage of social media and how does that play out in terms of the proper disclosures that need to be made. The Federal Trade Commission amended its rule in 2007, but already, I am sure, 7 years later, there are things there that are passé. They've taken account of the internet in a way that they didn't in 1978, but they're already probably behind the times in a lot of other areas. And no doubt the states face the same issues because most of the state laws were enacted, say, in the 70s. Franchising has expanded globally, and we're going to have some speakers this morning, well, really two, yours truly and Phil Zeidman. And Phil Zeidman is the guru, so he will be talking about international franchising. But the interesting thing here is just how much it has taken off throughout the world. And so many of the US branded organizations that we think of in franchising, really their tremendous growth in more recent times has been stemming mainly from development overseas. And as that happens, of course, many countries establish their own laws. Phil will get into this more, but it's important to understand that you have a mix, and this leads to more conflict, it leads to more opportunity for research and writing and class discussion, a mix of state laws, starting with California, took the lead, but about a third of the states have passed some rather involved laws, and then other states have passed some laws that have some impact in franchising. So there's a mix there. And usually you can classify a state in one of three categories. You could say it's a state that has simply disclosure obligations, which are found at the federal level as well. And they work together in effect. But pre-contractual duties of disclosure, you have states which have registration requirements, which is a little bit more like the SEC or securities law environment. The federal level, we don't have filings, we just have a disclosure obligation. And then some states, not too many, have ventured all the way to actual sort of regulation of some of the actual substantive areas of franchising. And how they usually get at this, I know in Michigan, I believe, and a few of the other states, is they will outright say, these things must be in your contract, or these statements have to be provided. So you can't just have a disclosure and you're fine. You have to actually put certain alleged protections in the contract itself. Franchise law is contract law. And since je parle un petit peu de français, I'll put on my second hat, or eighth if you were a surly person there at the grocery store and say each one of these counts as an item. France, I do some research on France. Phil will be talking about the international realm and probably not giving France the attention that the French deem it worthy of being attended to. But I do research in France partly because, well, it's an excuse to have somebody pay for me to go to Paris and elsewhere. France, though, is interesting to my mind because it's really the first nation outside the United States to kind of take the great leap forward into franchise regulation. And it did it in a way that has some similarities to the US. That's why I do some research in this area. It's got disclosure obligations. It really hasn't gone into the registration realm as well. It's comparable in some ways to the Federal Trade Commission rule. But the big difference is they don't even really specifically refer to franchising. Their loi du bain, which is an interesting law because most French laws, as I understand it, don't come with a name. You know, they just give a date, which is very hard to remember, the law of such and such date, the case of such and such a date. But Monsieur Dubin was in charge of a government department back 30 years ago, which instigated, if you will, this law. And because the law has primarily affected franchising type organizations, it's kind of viewed as the French franchise law. But if you actually read it, it's really referring to any law that deals with, in effect, some sort of territory and exclusivity and trademarks. And so it could apply to any sort of distribution. It could apply to a number of things which we would not consider to be actually franchising. And then, of course, it is spread throughout the world. It's gone all over the place, as Phil will discuss. And the growth of the legislation has been tremendous. It would have helped if I'd actually put down the actual numbers next to the lines so you could see, but I believe we're close to or about 40 nations that have passed laws. And like everything else, it's an interesting hodgepodge where you have some nations with laws that you think, do they even have franchising there? And yes, they do. Almost all countries have franchising. And then other big players in the system, such as Germany, let's say, or the UK, which don't have any sort of franchise-specific laws. But that is it for my introduction. I just want to reiterate how pleased I am to be here and how grateful I am to Min, Michelle, Brian, and others for helping to organize this gathering. And